Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum Price. Today I'm joined by our Editorial Director, Kristian Niemietz. Kristian recently picked up a book in a pub in Wetherspoons and is here today to tell us about it. Kristian, The First Workers' Government by Gilbert Mitchison. Walk us through what it argued about.
Yes, so the book is from 1934 and it describes, from his perspective, a near future socialist Britain. So in his timeline, 2 years in the future, so meaning 1936, there's a socialist revolution. And this story, this transition to a socialist economy is then told in retrospect. So there's a narrator who is further into the future, around the year 1980, who looks back and who tells a generation of people who have no idea what capitalism even is, or only vague, not even memories, but just some vague idea, something prehistoric for them. And he just tells them, this is how it happened. This is how the glorious people's paradise was built.
Much like the approach you took in your IEA paper, Home Win, right?
Yes, except he was a bit more ambitious. So I'm just imagining a Britain that builds houses. He imagines a completely different economic and political system. And so the way this happens, the timeline is initially extremely detailed, incredibly detailed, in fact. So in the late 30s, he talks about, and early 40s, he talks about a particular model of nationalization that is applied successively to industry after industry until basically everything is nationalized. So he doesn't describe that endpoint explicitly, but there are always parts where a private sector remains in place for now, but he always says, but this is a stopgap solution, and ultimately our aim is a fully socialized economy. And the implication, it's strongly implied that by the time, 1980, the time that this narrative is based in, that by then this has fully happened, and there is no such thing as a market anymore. There is no such thing as a private sector anymore. Everything is organized by the state, and everyone is happy in the workers' paradise. But the part that I found impressive about the book is just how much detail he goes into. And that's very different from today's socialists. So today, if you look at, say, Jacobin magazine, today's socialist publications, or Novara or Current Affairs, is always 90% is capitalism bashing, and then it's just vaguely implied that if only we had a socialist economic system, everything will be brilliant, everything will be better. But it's basically virtually nothing on how they want to do it. They just talk about abstract intentions. They describe this in very abstract terms, but you don't get a sense of how this should actually work in practice. Whereas Mitchison, he even has fictitious parliamentary acts that this socialist government is passing, where you could almost think of it as a legislative program, that an actual government could have passed this in that way. You could have used this as a program for a future government, and that was actually his hope. So he says that in the foreword, that this isn't some idle dreaming. He says this is the sort of program that the left of the Labour Party, the Marxist wing of the Labour Party, the sort of program that should appeal to them, and he hopes that a future socialist government will do something pretty much like that.
So rather than just saying, when the revolution comes and capitalism falls, we will do X, Y, Z, he actually gives a way to that might actually come about. Now, without getting into as much detail as maybe he does, can you run us through a little bit about what he thought would happen, how it would come to pass, and then maybe what he got right and what he got wrong in terms of what actually happened?
Yeah, so he has a nationalization concept where the owners get compensated. So it's not just a confiscation. And the reason why he does that is, he wants to do it gradually, right? He doesn't want to immediately nationalize everything. And the problem with gradualism, and socialists were discussing this at the time in the 1920s already, the problem with gradualism would be, imagine you come to power as a socialist, your long-term plan is to nationalize everything, but you start with one or two industries or a bit more. The problem then would be the capitalists in the remaining industries, they would of course know, oh, I'm going to be next. So what do then? You're not going to invest anything anymore. You will just run those industries down, and then try to escape before you get everything gets taken away from you. And so therefore, he comes up with a solution where they get a compensation payment, which is roughly the kind of profit they would have earned. On an annual basis over the next 25 years. So it means that these people are not financially much worse off than they would have been without nationalization. It's just that they no longer own the assets. And that is in a way quite consistent for a Marxist. So he doesn't take issue with the fact that people are rich. That's not his problem. The rich remain rich even in his socialist utopia, for the time being at least. What he takes issue with is that there are people who own the means of production. Because if you're a Marxist, you think that is what gives the capitalist class their power, that is their power base, and that is what you have to take away from them. But you don't necessarily want to have to shoot them or send them to the gulag, and that's why his revolution is a very polite and British one. Nobody gets sent to the gulag, nobody gets shot. But of course, you could then also say, well, that's where the unrealistic parts come in. So there is a certain amount of naivety about. So he goes through the various industries, gives an overview of British capitalism as it was in the mid-30s, and he starts with the railways and then goes into steel and iron and coal and various others, transport. And he always talks about inefficiencies. Saying, well, this industry is obviously inefficient. It doesn't make sense for coal mines to rely on independent transport providers that do the coal transport for them. Surely it would make much more sense for them to have their own integrated transport, so have this kind of vertical integration. And you always think, or I at least thought, okay, I don't know the details of the coal industry in the 1930s, but surely, if this is so obvious that vertical integration is beneficial to them, why don't they do it? Does he imagine all the capitalists, all the private sector entrepreneurs? Does he think they're all stupid? Does he think they're all just lazy, don't want to make money? So he has this absurd confidence that he can sit there in his study, writing a book and planning where the efficiency savings are going to come from. So there is a kind of belief in that central planning is going to lead to massive efficiency improvements, and that's something which today's socialists don't really do anymore in such a strong form. So today it's much more, the argument is that once we've nationalized this sector and that sector, they no longer have to make profits, and there will be no greedy businessmen in charge. But they wouldn't explicitly promise that once the state takes over an industry, that you will have a massive explosion in efficiency gains. So it's a very 1930s thinking.
I was about to say, is that partly because at that time in the early 1930s, the sort of debates over planning versus sort of the Hayekian model were really yet to take off properly, certainly in the mainstream. So that idea is that almost a sign, an illustration perhaps of Hayek and our side of the argument maybe winning out. The socialists today just accept that maybe central planning won't necessarily lead to efficiencies, although it will lead to all the other good things in their minds.
Yeah, there is definitely, you can tell that this is a product of its time, from the fact that there is this naive belief that there are all these obvious efficiency gains and you just have to take over the industries and then you're going to realize, and that's something which later socialists would no longer have made quite in this way. And yes, it is partly about socialist calculation debate, not really, well, at least it hadn't reached the English-speaking world. So Ludwig von Mises wrote about this in the early 20s, but that was taking place in German, those debates at the time. And I think it was in the mid or late 30s that the first translation of Mises became available. But yes, so Mitchison has an excuse for not knowing about that, and that's fair enough. And I think it's also simply the fact that this was during the Great Depression. So Britain was a bit less affected than other economies. It was not especially bad here, but nonetheless, he does talk about the surge in employment that happened as a result of that, and sees that as a problem of capitalism. And yes, I guess if you imagine, you see the situation in the United States being far worse. Well, in Germany, it was the Great Depression was quite clearly what brought what gave the Nazi Party that big boost. That's why they had their breakthrough in 1930. So you had, from that perspective, it must have seemed like capitalism is falling apart. All the Marxist prophecies are really coming true. And at the same time, you see the Soviet Union industrializing, being completely unaffected by this, what they would have seen as a crisis of capitalism. And it is somewhat understandable that a left-wing writer at the time would have thought, oh, look, in the West, capitalism is falling apart. It either means an ongoing depression and with mass unemployment, and that's the best case. In the worst cases, it means literal fascism. And then on the and at the other end of Europe, in the East, you have this new model, which is industrializing and growing rapidly. And you can see why these people would have thought, okay, this model is clearly the better one, and this is the future. And that was what lots of Western visitors to the Soviet Union said at the time, that they went on these guided tours for a week or two, visited Soviet factories, and came back and said, this is the future. Mm-hmm. This is the way to go.
So what happened?
Well, I mean, then the Hayekian problems all became more obvious later. But I don't think that's what the reason why socialists today are a bit more reluctant to overpromise, make the same arguments that an early socialist in the 30s would have made. I don't think many of them would take Hayekian, Misesian arguments on board. It's just that we've had so many examples of socialism, well, ending in failure every single time, that okay, modern day socialists would always say that's got nothing to do with us. We're doing real socialism. We're doing socialism properly. But even so, it would be a bit bold to say, but trust us, we're going to, you will get a productivity explosion just because we are in charge. So they're a bit more careful in making that argument, and they do that by talking mostly about fairness, democratizing the economy, and getting rid of the profit motive and all that. But say even so, until 10 years ago or so, you had lots of people, including on the British left, praising the Venezuela example, where they were saying, yes, Venezuela is doing quite well economically, which was true for a while, as long as they had these massive oil profits. But they were not saying that is the reason why they support Venezuela as a model. So they were much more likely to talk about the social programs and the cooperatives that they were building up, and just the fact that they no longer had what they would have called the old establishment being in charge of the economy. But they would be more reluctant to say, socialism means productivity improvements.
Yeah. So the future that he lays out, well, the then future, didn't quite come to pass.
No.
Given that he was writing from a hypothetical 1980, in which point Britain was going in a very different direction to what he had predicted. But what did he get right? What did he sort of outline that could happen, or would happen, or should happen from the early 1930s that actually sort of did come to pass?
Well, you could superficially read the second and third chapters, or where it's about nationalization of coal, steel, transport, railways. You could superficially read that as a preview of the Clement Attlee post-war government, but that would be a bit illusory, because what happens in the first workers' government is simply that everything gets nationalized. So therefore, any government that nationalizes something is going to look superficially a bit like that book. So I wouldn't really read it in that way. And even if you want to, I guess the big difference is simply that the Attlee government started very energetically, nationalized some industries, but then they ran out of steam and didn't quite know what else to do. And then they just had these nationalized industries, didn't know what to do with them. Whereas in the Mitchison case, these nationalizations create a sense of enthusiasm, and precisely because they have so much of an early success and things get clearly better for the people working in those industries and for the consumers buying their products, that creates a demand and a dynamism, a demand for more and more nationalizations. And in this way, this socialist revolution is self-accelerating, where the Attlee government was just the opposite of that. You had a couple of nationalizations, and then even the Labour Party after that. So the next Labour government didn't pick up there again. They didn't say, we will finish the job and we will finish what Attlee started. So even though they wouldn't have reversed it, but probably saw some of those nationalizations as a bit pointless. But nonetheless, nationalizations clearly did happen and remained in place for quite a while until they were undone again by the Thatcher government. But even then, you could say Mitchison already predicts the NHS. He doesn't call it that. He doesn't have a name in his book, but he talks about the socialization of the medical profession and the hospitals. So that is the NHS basically. And there is also, as part of in his book, all the land gets nationalized, right? And that means you have the government deciding which parcels of land are going to be used for agriculture, which for urban development, which for industry, and which for something else. Now, okay, that didn't happen in this way, but we now have a land use planning policy where the government does essentially, even though it doesn't own the land, it does get to decide how land can be used. And the motivation for that originally was that under private ownership, you just have this chaotic, haphazard development where there is no overall plan, and therefore it results in complete chaos. You have some people building something somewhere, and elsewhere in the country, other landowners do their own thing, and that there's nobody with an overall view saying, wait, we should rearrange this more rationally. So you could say the land use planning system that we have today was inspired by that kind of mindset, even though it didn't result in the literal state ownership of land, unlike what happens in this book. So yeah, but part of it did come true, and I would also say the reason why the book feels relevant today is simply that the issue of nationalization, that's still very much with us. Mm-hmm. So over the past couple of years, I've seen at least a dozen surveys where people are asked, would you nationalize this industry? Would you nationalize that industry? And they usually say yes. So nationalization is still incredibly popular. And
even today, the government are announcing the next step of their plan to renationalize the trains. It's very much not going anywhere as an idea, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's literally chapter 3 in the book.
Well, there you go. Kristian, thank you for taking the time. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to read Kristian's full review, it is available on our Substack. That's at insider.iea.org.uk. And until next time, thanks very much.